Beginning with Richard the Lionheart's Crusades, a war has been pitted between Arab and Western culture. In medieval times, the Crusades opened up Middle Eastern trade networks to European countries. This new connection between the Middle East and Europe allowed European culture to flourish, adopting Arab technology and philosophy. Yet as the West continued to rely on Middle Eastern trade, they seemingly began to more and more establish their imperial dominance over Arab empires. And it is because effective regional stability today in the Middle East can only be established through an end of Western imperial power that it becomes imperative that we analyze how oil has been a primary cause of Western militaristic action in the Middle East. We will first examine how the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was driven by the USSR's oil desires. Then we will explore how the US's policy post 9/11 were motivated by weakened Iraqi oil networks. And finally, we will discuss potential steps forward for Western policy regarding the Arab states. The current political sphere in the Middle East is defined by Soviet action in the late 70s and early 80s. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Soviet action in this context is largely analyzed through and believed to be a result of Cold War competition in relation to democratization and the competition between the spread of communism. However, Dr. Alla Ivanchikova illustrates a different narrative. Dr. Ivanchikova explains that the Western world's relationship post-industrialization with Afghanistan was largely centered around oil, and that while Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was motivated by political competition, it was also driven by Soviet desire for Afghan oil. Dr. Ivanchikova continues by referencing an article by James D.J. Brown. Brown explains how in 1979 Soviet Russia faced an extraordinary surge in domestic oil prices that occurred that year as a result of turmoil in the Middle East. Brown suggests that the Soviet government feared economic instability as a result of a rise in oil prices, and that this led them to see terror threats in Afghanistan as more legitimate than they might have actually been. Brown furthers to determine that this form of Soviet action can be referred to as petromania, oil-induced politics without limits. It is this concept of petromania stemming in contemporary politics from Soviet action that has defined Western policy in the Middle East. This concept of petromania is also apparent in the United States policy in regards to the Arab states. After 9/11, the U.S.'s foreign policy drastically changed. The Bush administration invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and began the American War on Terror. Bush's actions following 9/11 were predominantly interpreted as a defensive act against terrorism. Yet even scholars who support Bush's actions post 9/11 agree that Bush's policy was clouded by oil influence. Professor Paul Pillar explains that Iraq's oil resources were part of what made Iraq an important and influential state in the Middle East, and thus one where it's hoped that a change would serve as a catalyst for change elsewhere in the region. Marcus Heinrich continues to elaborate that the Bush administration hoped that removing Saddam Hussein would result in a domino effect, where all regimes in the Middle East hostile to the U.S. and its interests in the region would be intimidated into cooperation. Meaning that the Bush administration's actions following 9/11, while they were in part a response to terrorism, were ultimately about establishing U.S. control over Middle Eastern oil. Because today, and as Antonio Juaz articulates, for the first time in 30 years, Western oil companies are exploring and producing oil in Iraq from some of the world's largest oil fields and reaping enormous profit. And while the U.S. has also maintained a fairly consistent level of Iraq oil imports since the invasion, the benefits are not finding their way through Iraq's economy or society. Thus, it would appear as though U.S. action in Iraq were again motivated by the Bush administration's hunger for control over Iraqi oil networks, in other words, petromania, ultimately leaving Iraq war-torn and seemingly imperialized. Solutions to the disease that is petromania are unfortunately quite complex. However, similar to most diseases, understanding and acknowledging petromania and the role it plays in influencing policy, particularly in the Middle East, is the first step in establishing Arab stability. Professor David Mutimer explains that in order to create alternative security policies from the perspective of the oppressed, the present argument suggests that the need first to construct images of security problems which privilege their interests elaborate on how this process can be initiated in the political realm. Mutimer continues to elaborate that there needs to be a shift in the mindset behind policy that responds to conflict in the Middle East. Countries like the United States and Russia need to view aid in the Middle East through the lens of helping Arab citizens, rather than protecting their own assets. Thus, for this cycle of destabilization to end, countries around the world need to begin to change their development of foreign policy from one centered around principles of domestic protectionism to ones that reflect a globalized system of concern for the international community's stability. Thus, just like how Arab culture and resources were extorted in the Middle Ages, the Middle East will continue to be devastated by Western imperialist development until this shift in political understanding can be realized. And it is because effective regional stability in the Middle East today can only be obtained through an end of Western imperial power that we recognize how oil has been the root cause of Western action in the Middle East throughout the last century.